The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Keep your mission on your mind and your mind on your mission. This is Mission Minded with Michael Coleman.
Oh, one of my favorite shows, one of my favorite people, Michael Coleman. This is called Mission Minded, formerly the Jimmy Hill Mission. Now, of course, the Montgomery Food Bank. They take care of 35. How many counties? We got 58 counties in the state?
67.
67. I say 58 because it's on my license plate in Shelby County. But yeah, do more than half. That's pretty amazing stuff, and of course does a fantastic job down there. Michael's been working in business his entire life, but he's done a lot of non-for-profit stuff, and so we came up with this idea to do a show about not only non-for-profit business, but for-profit as well. And I know you found a very interesting article. Before we get into that, don't forget, Mission Minded is on every single Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. We have a lot of people that listen outside the Birmingham market in different time zones. People listen to it all around the world. We had someone in Yemen listening last week, which is fantastic. And of course, you can also go to Tony Kurre Radio Podcast. Just Google Tony Kurre Radio Podcast. It's Kurre with a K. And you can listen to all of our previous episodes. We have a description at the bottom of each one with hashtags, so you kind of get an idea of where we're going to be going. But fantastic stuff. And I love when you come to the table with some great stuff, and you found a very interesting article that is kind of about you, because you're kind of the boss man. What'd you find?
Yeah. So it's, a couple of things about it. I'm always looking on, as I scroll through LinkedIn and other things, I'm always looking to find things that can help me look at, keep up with the latest trends, but also things that can help me assess as to what kind of boss I'm being and how to be better or more, whether I need to be more sensitive to the employees or I get too out of balance one way or another. And so, I like to pull these kind of things. And sometimes, like in our morning meeting this morning, we had a director's meeting. And so I had all the leaders together and we talked about this particular article. And it was very interesting to me because here's an expert that is dealing. His name is Tom Gimbel, mm-hmm. And he's talking about workplace culture. He's an expert in workplace culture, and he mentioned something I thought was very interesting. Like I said, this is not necessarily nonprofit. This is really anywhere. Yeah. But he talked about that I believe it's 82% of people leave companies because of their boss, or the boss has a huge influence on that. And so the whole idea is people don't quit companies, but they quit bosses. And it's very true. So he names 7. And what I like about this is he just didn't come up with them. He actually ranked them based on his research as to which one's the most common. Yeah. And out of these 7, he said, there's only one worth having. Wow. And of course, so what I want you to do, I thought, well, I'm going to turn the tables on you, and I'm going to interview you for just a second, or at least get you guessing. Sure. Think back over your life as to some of the best bosses, some of the worst bosses, and the ones that were most problematic to you, and let's see what category they fit in here on this list. All right. Well, I've had, and I have not seen this list, so I had 14 different general managers in the 31 years I was a Cumulus doing radio here in town. And every one of them had a good side and a bad side. And ironically enough, I think probably my best GM was the one that fired me, so maybe I kind of was hoping I'd have one of these other GMs. But when you asked me that question before we started on the air, I could start rolling through them. So the one, I don't really know if this is a type of boss, but he was the open door boss. He was always the one that said, my door's always open. Come by and talk to me anytime you want. And that lasted for about 4 or 5 months. And then all of a sudden the door was closed, or I never saw him again. That's one of my bosses. Another boss that we all absolutely loved, and we call it a player's manager, was the boss that wanted to be friends with everybody. He invited the employee. Yeah, he invited. I will tell you, the want to be your best friend forever boss. Yep. Invited you over to his house for parties. Would go out to strip clubs with you. There was no line there. It was just like, but he'd be quick to yell at you too. I'll be like, dude, we just went out last night. I had a great time, and you got here after I did, and next thing you know, you're catching crap because you got in late. I had that boss.
I had the boss that knew everything. The boss that
so we're going to call that the narcissistic boss.
Okay. That would be the boss that, didn't really want to hear any of my ideas. And if I threw an idea at him that he didn't know, he would take it as his own.
That's the narcissistic
and would not give me any credit for it. And then the other boss that I think a lot of people have is the boss you can't find. And in a lot of cases, people like that boss because, we'd always say it's like the principal's office. As long as I'm not in the boss's office, it's a good day. But that's also not good for business. That would be a business that.
Yeah, that's on there as well. So you've named at least 3, but they call that the ghost boss.
The ghost boss, yeah. And
never around.
Yeah. And that's, when the cat's away, right? So
that's right.
That's one of the situations where.
Human nature, that's something so interesting to me because I was just talking about this and said, listen, if you build a culture, people will respond within that culture if the expectation is made very clear to them, and that's enforced and reinforced from the top down that, hey, this is my expectation when I'm not here or when I am here. This is the way you kind of conduct yourself and you kind of understand. Like in the food banking world, I try to say, listen, we want to be a yes first organization. And so that stresses a lot of people out because when they don't feel like they have any more bandwidth, they just say no. Well, one of the things, and this is a little food banking specific, but it can relate anywhere, is one of the jobs that we have is food sourcing. So if we get more food than we can distribute out to our population, then there's a network where we can load this food up and people at other networks can go in there and get that food, can get it by the truckloads. And not buy the food, but get it on by the truckloads. And so not only do we have a responsibility to get food for our people, but it's also to get as much food as the stores there as we can get donated from the stores and collect all that. So it's just food sourcing is a top priority. And but that means it's hard. It's easier to say no. And I'm like, if somebody comes to us and says, hey, I want to partner and I've got an idea, my answer is always yes. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to do that idea, nor does it mean we're going to be able to do that idea. But I don't shut down ideas. I don't shut down thoughts. We want to say, yes, I will take the time to sit down and hear your idea out. And it's hard if you've been in an organization who's used to saying no because you're like, I can't take any more work on. And so what I'm all about is let's streamline our process. The reason we don't have any more bandwidth, is it because we have too much work to do, or is it because our processes are not adequately streamlined? So if we get that under control, what we find is that some of that bandwidth opens up. And so anyway, that was just part of the discussion that we're always having here. So you got the ghost boss, you've got the narcissist boss, you got the want to be your best friend boss. Can you think of anything, any other types that you've had? Are you stumped?
No, I mean, when
I tell you the rest, you're going to be able to come up with them. Somebody's going to pop in your mind.
Well, I'll say this because you did mention that most of these bosses are not good, but certainly the thoughtful boss, the boss that is always there, and he's a good boss. He's open minded and takes, much like yourself, wants to learn. We make mistakes, and I guess that would be you're an accountable. You're accountable for your actions. You're responsible for what you're doing. He's very forgiving, but you better get your work done type of boss. Is that one of them?
Yeah, so yeah, that's the one they want to work for. They said that's the one where there's accountability, but they're also a caring boss, so they're able to balance the employee, but they're running it as a business, but they're not totally callous to the needs of the employee, and they try their best to reconcile those two things. So I will tell you that I've seen where sometimes you go into organizations and employees have built little kingdoms where they are, and this is my position and these are my things, and you stay away from that. And if you move them because you feel like they're a better fit within the organization, it would almost be characterized as you're doing them wrong, that somehow you've done some injustice to them. And that's a mindset sometimes employees get in, that, oh, this is my territory. You hired me to do this job. But you always have to understand that a business has to do what's in the best interest of that business. been talking about this a lot, that when I came in here to the food bank, same as when I went to Jimmy Hill, I found out we had square pegs and we had round pegs. And guess what? An organization needs both. You need square pegs and round pegs. The problem is sometimes you have the square peg in the round hole and the round peg in the square hole. Mm-hmm. And that's problematic. So what you've got to do is be able to put the square peg with the square hole. And sometimes that's learning what somebody's strengths and weaknesses are and understanding where that's the best fit. Sometimes it's just a trial by error. Yeah, you put them there and you see, whether you're not getting as much productivity out of them, and so you put them over here because you think this will better, and you kind of wait and see, and maybe even you have to move them again. And I don't want to. It feels like sometimes you're kind of jerking employees around. I'm not trying to do that, but above everything else, I have a responsibility to run this as a business. And what I like to do is be able to run it effectively as a business, but also meet the employees' needs as best I can. What I can't do is set aside the business aspect and put all the needs of the employees, because there's so many different needs. And so ends up what you end up doing is you lose sight of the fact that, wait a minute, this nonprofit is in place to feed hungry people. And if you go too much one side toward the employees, then what happens is you can't get as much food out because you're losing productivity. And so the people who suffer, not necessarily just from a business standpoint, it's the people you're serving in the community. So it's a constant balancing act of trying to say, I want to be that boss that's accountable, holds employees accountable, but also want to be an effective work environment where they feel valued and they feel supported and they feel cared about. But it's just a real challenge. Let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
The one they say is the most common boss is the grinder boss, and that probably is self-descriptive. But have you ever had a grinder boss?
Based on my skill level and what radio's all about, we really never had we had a micromanager boss. I don't know if that's a grinder boss or not. We really never had a guy. And a grinder sounds like a guy just you can't get enough work done. I mean, you're there late, you're getting there early.
That's the premise, is that it's all about the work.
Yeah. And
they don't care about what's going on in your life. It is. And if you do your task well, you get rewarded by giving more. You're given more tasks.
Yeah. Yeah. And
a few weeks ago, I spoke about that, talking about how we pack mule people, where, you go into any church. I've seen this very common. It's a very common saying where 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And that's because if you get somebody who sometimes can't say no, they don't know how to say no, and they feel like they have to say yes to everything. And they do a good job and they care about it. They're like, wow, they did that. Well, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. And for too long, those people's knees begin to buckle. They burn out, or they have to quit altogether because we've just overwhelmed them. And that's kind of what that grinder boss is. He has that mindset is, I'm going to keep plowing away. And then I'll just, people are expendable. Yeah. When I burn this one out, I'll get another one. All right. I didn't know if you'd ever experienced that or not.
No, I never really had the grinder boss, just because, we are in a creative type of situation. Radio's creative, and that doesn't really jive a whole lot. The boss that comes walking in the studio during your show, kind of stuff, that does because you have to be on your game. I do have 3 more bosses though, as you've spoken. First of all, the alcoholic boss.
Was he a happy drunk or was he a mean drunk?
Well, he was happy when the numbers were good, but when it wasn't good, he drank that away too. The other one, and I've had 3 of these. The hatchet boss. Was that on the list? The boss that's hired to come in and clean the joint up. Fire people, get rid of people, get rid of the extra fat. And then, of course, they'd always promise they'd bring stuff back, because they never did. But everyone was like, this is a hatchet guy. He's here to cut shows from 3 people to 2 people. He's the budget boss. He's the cleanup boss. He's the boss that does whatever it takes to clean up the bottom line so he gets his bonus, and then he's gone after 2 years. Is that on the list?
Well, it's a little familiar. Well, it's something close to this called the volcano boss, which is is somebody you don't necessarily see, but when you see, you just know he could blow up at any time. But it's all rooted in that same thing. He's wanting numbers, he's wanting performance, he's just not emotionally stable. Whether you just don't know what to expect from one moment to the next.
Yeah,
it could be a tough situation. But thankfully, that is the one rated the least common boss. The other one is, I was going to say, you touched on this, a motivator boss is a little bit different than the want to be your best friend boss. The motivator boss is one who is constantly, you can do it, but the problem is you never bring any accountability, even if you're just trying to speak life into them,
mm-hmm.
but you never get to the point to where you go, okay, I've spoken enough life. Now I'm going to have to place my foot in a special place
mm-hmm.
To get them going. And people will despise the motivator boss, because if all you're doing is motivating all the time, first of all, if you pat somebody on the back every time they go to the bathroom, like, oh, good job in the bathroom, after a while that just falls on deaf ears. If you praise them for every single thing, so you don't want to overpraise, because it just rings hollow after a while. But the motivator boss is just all the time, just not bringing that accountability, and just always is giving the pep talk, and that it just runs out after a while. Its effectiveness.
Now you've been a boss for a long period of time, so I want to throw a couple questions back at you.
Okay.
And you pretty much stick to your guns. I know what kind of guy you are, and I know people love to work for you. Do you change your bossing skills or characteristics based on the employee that you're dealing with at the time? In other words, can you be more than one of these bosses? Can you be a blow-up boss with a person that needs to be motivated, but also a very compassionate and maybe caring boss, nice job going to the bathroom, to a person that just doesn't really have the personality to take? I used to talk to Aldo Greco all the time, and he saw that in coaches a lot. He would see a coach act one way to one player and then a totally different way to a totally different player, and he's like, what the hell? I just saw you be really nice to this guy, and you're just sitting here giving me all kinds of difficulty. And is that okay to do? Can you be a chameleon boss?
Well, the answer to that question is yes, but it's very hard to do. And I think your best bosses are chameleon bosses, but everything with me comes back to relationship. And so this is, again, why the relationship is so important, because if you take the time to know your employees, I recognize some employees, they're really motivated, but so I don't need to give them a rah-rah. They're self-motivated. So that rah-rah falls on deaf ears. They have other challenges. So sometimes I have to stand up and say, wait a minute, you're fixing to cross a boundary, and I have to be more stern with them. There's other times to where if I'm stern with somebody, it totally destroys them. So if I want to get the same effect, I can't have a one-size-fits-all approach and then just make everybody adjust to me. Now to some degree, I'd like to keep things lighthearted, so I like to do that. And some people take teasing better than others. So I try to pay attention. Well, who kind of laughs along with being teased, teases back, and then those who get upset by it. I really do try to not be provocative in a way that hurts somebody's performance or makes them feel devalued. However, I'm not willing to change who I am, but I am willing to change my approach if I feel like it's better for that employee. Now, that goes back to a little bit about my faith, going back to, without getting on a sermon here, but, the Apostle Paul talked about, being all things to all people. And so, I want to be able to hurt with those who are hurting. I want to be able to laugh with those who are laughing. And it's very difficult for me I like a jovial type environment where we're cutting up, where we're kind of laughing. Now, it doesn't mean we don't take what we do serious, but we can do it and still have a good time. The problem is, I've learned that some people can't self-regulate. So I have to be careful of how much I do that with, because if I joke with them, then they don't know when the joke ends and to get back to work.
Yeah.
And so it is a constant conversation I have going on in my head. But what I don't want to do is go, oh, okay, well, this person doesn't joke well, or this person can't take a joke, or this person is uber sensitive. I can't just separate and then say, okay, I'm only going to hang out with these or talk to these employees. What I have to now say is, well, how do I communicate with this employee? Because I have to do it differently. And if I don't take the time to approach this person differently, then I'm sending them a message that they don't have equal value. I don't care about them. And that's on me as a leader. So I have to be intentional about what I'm doing, pay attention to the message that I'm sending. Because I will tell you, I've gone into organizations before, and one of the things we did, we went out to work one time and I invited everybody along, and we just said, we're going out to a public place. If you want to have a beer or whatever, that's fine. Well, some people didn't feel comfortable because they didn't want to drink. And of course, it wasn't mandatory that they did. It was just optional.
Yeah.
But they felt, because of that environment, they felt like, well, then they were not really welcome, that they would kind of stick out like a sore thumb. So then it kind of said, now I'm on the outs with the boss and I'm not part of the in group and all that. So I did away with that. And a lot of people say, well, you shouldn't let one or two affect that. And I said, well, I understand that sentiment, but I'm not going to intentionally do anything that's going to make anybody in my organization feel as though that they're less than, especially when it comes to something like that. So I just tried to find a different way to build that rapport with our folks.
Yeah, Michael Coleman joins us.
It's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Michael Coleman joins us here. Mission Minded, keep your mind your mission, your mission your mind. With the Montgomery Food Bank, they cover 35 counties in the great state of Alabama. He does a wonderful job, formerly of the Jimmy Hill Mission. Another boss question I have for you, and I think it's really, really interesting. I think a lot of people think that just because they're working for a non-for-profit, that it's gonna be softer, because there's not a profit, there's not a line at the end. We have to make money for our shareholders or make it for our bigger bosses. And sometimes I find, and I'll use this as an example, and I know there was a lot written about when Jerry Lewis was doing the Muscular Dystrophy Association, how just stringent and difficult that organization was to work for a period of time, because there was a bottom line. You must reach your budget at any cost. This is what we need to do. And it got to the point where people who were giving annually were getting phone call after phone call. Can you do more? Can you do more? Can you do more? And they lost a lot of donors because of it. What do you think about those bosses that, quite frankly, and maybe they came from a different business where it was a for-profit business, but they don't really have that softer, compassionate feel when it comes to a non-for-profit?
I will tell you that if you look across the board at nonprofits, usually you find if it was going to be weighted to one side or the other, you're going to find the ones that are so compassionate but they don't know how to run a business. Now, you have some that can run a business but don't keep the customer in mind, and that's a whole different set of problems. But I say the norm is that I've encountered, at least, is that you have people who deeply care about the people they're serving. They're in the nonprofit world because they want to help people. They love people. They care about the fact of maybe it's early pregnancy, early crisis in pregnancy, and they want to help teen moms or people who are hungry, or people who are in addiction, whatever. It doesn't matter, whatever the field is. There's so many good nonprofits out there doing so much good work. But the bottom line is, if you don't run it like a business, you're not going to be around long term to be able to help the people you care about. And they simply either don't have the background for it, or they don't. That's just not what they're interested in. It is. You have to make business decisions when it comes to employees, and lots of times you have to make hard decisions. And the reality is, we just don't like doing hard things. And so when it's uncomfortable, when it's difficult, we avoid it. And so what ends up happening, I cannot begin to tell you the number of times I've seen this, is nonprofits become mediocre. Mm-hmm. and there's no sense of urgency. There's no sense of let's do it better, because to do it better means you're going to hold a standard out there and you're not going to compromise off that standard. And if people can't meet that standard, you have to say, okay, we're going to give you an opportunity. We're going to train you. We're going to support you. We're going to give you all the tools you need, all the training you need. But if you can't make that standard, then you can't be here. Yeah. And that's just a conversation that some people can't bring themselves to.
This is Mission Minded. You can hear it every single day of the week, 10 o'clock in the morning Central Time, wherever you're listening, 10 o'clock Central. And, of course, wherever you get your podcast, Tony Kurre Radio Podcast. Search Tony Kurre Radio. That's Kurre with a K. Info at TonyKurreRadio.net. If you got your email questions, we'll read those as well. I want to ask you one final question as a boss, and we'll turn the tables on you since you asked me some questions. There is one employee that is part of every organization, and everyone hates this employee. Do you know what employee I'm talking about?
It's part of every organization.
Yeah, as soon as a new boss comes in, this guy turns his head up.
Oh, is it the one that's sucking up, bringing him?
Yes, the kiss ass employee. I call him the kiss ass employee. Sorry, I know this is a family show, but I mean, and this is the guy that normally doesn't hit budget. Every time I go by the boss's office, he's sitting in there. He's always, hey, boss, I got a question for you on this, that, and the other. The guy never gets fired. He's been there for 20 years, but he's always the guy that wants to be he wants to be the wingman to the boss. First of all, as a boss, do you see through that? And second of all, how does that change the delicacy, if you will, of the relationships with the other employees in the office? Because I know exactly who that guy is, and he's a nice guy. He really is, and I genuinely believe that he's not particularly. He's never the best at what he does. He has his moments, but he's always right there with the boss.
Yes, I've seen it, and yes, I've sometimes handled it well, and sometimes I've not handled it well, because when you go into an organization and there's lots of people that want to be the first to sit down with you, because what they want to do is they want to define your view, how you're going to filter everything else. And so I've had that before where somebody met with me, we sat and talked for hours, and they filled me in on all the history of the organization and all the people, and basically set themselves up as being, and I left that meeting saying to myself, well, this man, we're really blessed to have this person. Well, it didn't take me long to find out that it was all a charade. Yeah. And so the question is, when that happens, what are you going to do to change that dynamic? And sometimes you're in so deep, it's like, I start off depending on this person so much, and then I find out this person's really the problem. And again, it all comes back. I've tried to say one thing above everything else is we're going to be consistent. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that there's not times that in trying to be consistent, applying the standards, that you may go a little left or a little right. But when I said, here's the standard for everybody, and everybody in the organization, to include myself, has to follow this standard, well, then that person wasn't following the standard. And so it was easy to point them out. I mean, they in essence highlighted their own selves as not making the standard of everybody else. And so then when I asked those questions and started digging down, then that person became exposed.
So which boss, do you have the list of the 7 bosses to finish up our show in front of you?
I do.
Give me those 7 bosses and tell us again, there's only one that's really worth a flip, but tell me the 7 bosses.
Here are the 7 bosses as according to this workplace culture expert, Tom Gimbel, from the most common to the least common. So there's the grinder boss. That's the one just cares about just getting more out, more productivity, doesn't care about you as a person. There's a motivator boss that's just constantly patting you on the back, and for everything you do and every time you turn around, you're getting an attaboy. And after a while, it just wears thin because you haven't done anything that's really worth praising for necessarily. You got the ghost boss who's never around. You got the narcissist boss that everything's got to be his way. Everything's got to be about him or her and how it affects them. Then you got the want to be your best friend boss, and the problem with that is, of course, when it comes time to hold somebody accountable, that's a very difficult conversation to have. And then the next to last is the boss that most people want, which is the accountable boss, but the caring boss. And that's the balance I talked about, the accountability of you're the business. You have to do this in the best interest of the business. So you're accountable for your processes. You're accountable for your productivity. You're accountable for all this, but you don't do it. You try to find where's that win-win. How do I can still have a successful business and care deeply about my employees and make allowances for them where I can that can support them. And when they're hurting or when they're having just regular life issues like we all do, it's not just, we'll get back to work. I don't care about that. So I'm not there, but I'm striving every day to get there. And then the last, and it is the least, I guess, is the volcano boss. It just erupts and blows up. And so it's just really volatile, and you never know what you're going to get from one day to the next.
That's really, I mean, you mentioned it right at the top of the show that 82% of people leave their business of choice because of the boss, which sounds high, but it doesn't. And then when you tell me that the one boss that most people want is sixth on this list, that makes sense, and that's really sad.
Yeah, because I would just tell you, please don't. I may know what to do, but that doesn't mean I'll always do it. And because there's sometimes where I'm like, it's easier to be these other bosses, but sometimes I take shortcuts, and I catch myself taking shortcuts because it's easier. And we're just like electricity. People will take the path of least resistance, and I'm certainly no exception to that rule. But there are times where I'm like, this person's hurting, and I have to stop in the moment and say, what's more important, this employee and what they're hurting about, or this problem over here? And I have to be, if I just did what I normally do, I go deal with the problem. But I have to be intentional and take the time to let that employee know. And what I found out is, it's not just what happens in the moment, but that pays dividends down the road, because I've had employees come back months after and tell me that these little small interactions meant the world to them. And I didn't have any, I don't even remember the interaction, but it meant the world to them. And so that helps me understand from their perspective that me taking the time to do these things is truly beneficial to them, and it's something that they need. And again, creates this loyalty. They're not necessarily loyal to the organization, but if their boss cares about them and they can go to their boss and talk about anything, then somebody's not going to come around and lure them away for an extra $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 a year. Anybody's going to leave if it's enough money, but they're like, no, I have a good boss, and I don't want to risk more money going into a bad situation. So you will build a lot of loyalty by taking that time to be supportive, as supportive as you can.
Yeah, and we're running way over, and we only have about 3 minutes left. But I have to ask you the question: why are these people in these positions? I mean, what is being seen at a higher level, the ownership or whatever? And maybe you're talking about franchises in different cities. When you're picking out bosses to run your employees, why don't we have better bosses? Have they been in the organization a long time, and it's just a natural progression of them getting that position? Is it not the right people believing they're not leadership enough in order to be that boss? What is it?
I tell you, I think that lots of times that leadership is we have so many leaders in the world, but you have so many poor leaders. And I think lots of times in the nonprofit world, you have a board of directors who are not looped into the mission fully. They're not committed to the mission. This is an extra task of hiring somebody, and then you get 12, 15, 20 people in a room trying to decide who's that next best leader, and they each are looking for one or two things. And but I think lots of times is they themselves aren't necessarily, don't know what to look for. So you've sometimes got the blind trying to hire the blind. Yeah. And so if you don't know what a successful boss looks like, let's say if you're the ghost boss or the motivator boss or the grinder boss, you're trying to get somebody that looks like you. And then when they come in, you think, oh, I've hired the right person. and then they get out there in the culture, and then I'm running the organization, and then they're a disaster.
Yeah.
And or I will tell you, actually, I don't want to say they're a disaster. The norm is that they're mediocre.
Yeah.
And they can keep their head above water, but they neither aspire to excel or have any plan to excel, and then they just muddle through serving people with no real dynamic impact, or certainly taking the time to see what kind of impact they could have. They just get through year after year.
Michael, fantastic show, man. Great show. Next week, we're going to talk about how to build and sustain a legacy in the business world, and we'll talk about that. We'll take your emails. If you have any emails or questions about that next show, info@TonyCurryRadio.net, or the one we just did, info@TonyCurryRadio.net. Listen to Mission Minded 10 o'clock Central Time in the morning every Monday through Friday, and wherever you get your podcast. Michael, thank you so much, man. Appreciate you.
Hey, enjoyed it, brother.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.